Welcome back to the Art of Non-Discrimination and your host Christian Fanli Ramsey. So today I wanted to talk briefly kind of about the strange nature of reality. So just to start this off, I want to give an example that shows us variation. So we know about variation, and we know about stories or narrative. And within a narrative, we explain a situation. Now, it's very peculiar that a lot of times when we are talking in story, we feel that when we explain a situation, that the situation itself unveils the nature of the experience that someone is having. So I'll give you an example. If I tell you that someone didn't have a mother and a father, I'm explaining their childhood situation. And from there, we might assume that we now know what that might be like, what it might be like to not have a mother and father. And so we might hear that and say, oh, I'm so sorry if the person tells us that, because we have already assumed that the conscious experience of that was negative. And we know that different beings or people or even animals in general experience the same situation differently. So why do we assume that the situation gives us knowledge about the conscious experience? So this is the strange nature of reality, is that reality is actually empty. It's undetermined. So that means that given any situation, we imbue situations with what we predict to be the conscious experience of it, even if we ourselves have not consciously experienced it. And we might take that for granted because we assume that consciousness is shared and that people have similar conscious experiences. But the freaky reality is that we, especially in our ego state, only experience our own consciousness. We're the only person who knows what it's like to be us. And that isn't necessarily what it's like to be human. It's what it's like to be this entity. And we have this thing called intersubjective agreement that gives us a perception of a shared consciousness, but not necessarily is in itself shared consciousness. So I think there's a few things to tease apart there. One is that we are utterly unique in our experience, and that only we experience this life, and we assume that other people have what it is like to be them. And then we also assume that we can know that to more or less know that experience and what it's like. I think that sets up our delusion that we would know from a situation what the conscious experience would be like. Many of us have gotten on roller coasters and feel like if someone else has been on that roller coaster, we too have experienced the same thing. And certain people think that it's more alike than others. And I think in a way you can say that the more alike you think your experience is, or the more uniform you think an experience of a roller coaster is, the more deluded your current state of mind is, which isn't so much an attribute, but is kind of the karmic conditions that are set up now. So now let's go back. So let's take this a bit further. In Chinese, the words are, I believe it's 空虚, which is emptiness. or sunyata, or shunyata. And basically what that means is that our concepts don't have any intrinsicness to them. Phenomena don't have any intrinsic qualities. On one level, they rise when the conditions are ready for them, and they fall away when the conditions are not there anymore. And so what that means is any given situation could be experienced with the multitude of experiences. So someone could not have a mother and father and experience that in a very happy way, or in a very neutral way, or in a very sad way, or in a very depressed way. And it's utterly not determinable up front. Now we also have statistics, right? The science of statistics or probability that give us a view into how we might predict that. But that doesn't tell us about an individual. Statistics always tells us about a random group of people. So statistics tells us a probability, and that allows us to make predictions about huge swaths of people and what they might experience. But when we deal with an individual, statistics isn't at play. And often we make categorical errors or group individual errors or fallacies, ecological fallacies, by looking at the group average and assuming that the individual would have that average. But that's not how statistics works. It works at the level of groups and not individuals. So statistics gives us something to use to hedge our bet on. But we have to remember it's just an estimate, and that estimate will be wrong some of the time. And that within any probability, that every single possible feasible option has some sort of probability of happening. And so, in a way, you can imagine that emptiness, the way emptiness has been explained to me in many ways, you can see emptiness as that basically, since no phenomena has any self-existence, including ourselves, we don't have a self that comes from our own side, then that means that it's always dependent on other things. And that's called dependent arising, or dependent origination, or interdependence, or interbeing. So emptiness means that that a blanket for one person is something to keep them warm, and for another person it's a clothing item that they can wear as a dress. And so we try to build the world up by assigning it all sorts of fixed identity so that we can operate it on that way. We know what a door is for. And now we can operate in this world because all of these things that appear to us now appear to have this function or this self-existence. We go to the door, a door is for opening and closing and knocking. But it's not for dancing on. It's not for cooking. But the reality is spooky in some ways because the door doesn't have any intrinsic nature or intrinsic function. It's not it's not for anything. Even if the designers design it in a way to where it's for something. The truth of the chair, of the table, of the door is that it is empty of self-existence. It is empty of a function. That it has to be imbued with a function by people. We don't know what a lion would make of a chair, and we actually don't know what really how chairs are used around the world. I work in a design firm where kind of design is meant to fix things. It's meant to fix the identity of things to be for something. And it's a huge problem, right? Because you want people to perceive it to be for something. So part of the research we do quantitative and qualitative research. So part of the qualitative research is we look for people who are using products in so-called incorrect ways as a way to teach us. And actually what we're looking for is emptiness. The only reason that can happen is because things are actually empty. Things are not for anything at all. But that would be, for some people, a terrifying world that everything is empty and that we imbue value to it. But there was a sutra called the Avatamsaka Sutra, and it was part of the school in China called Huayan, which is like the flower garland sutra, and it beautifully expounds this description of the positive aspect of emptiness. So it's not just nothingness or voidness. It's actually that everything exists inside of a single thing. And it's depending on how we look at it, how we come to it, what our conditions are, that it shows up in a certain way. So Geshe Michael Rocha said that you have something called a remote control for a TV, and a person comes into the room, sees it as a remote to change channels, and a dog comes into the room and sees it as a chew toy. Another person comes into the room and sees the remote as something to put to make one of the chairs not wobble, so it goes under there. So which person has the correct definition of the remote control? Now we might be tempted to say that it's the first person because it's called a remote control, but we forgot that we merely labeled that and we're merely conditioned to believe that is the function of it, but in reality it's empty. So then if you take the Avatamsaka kind of Huayan view of it, it means that it is it contains everything. So that remote is all those things and many, many more. It is almost everything in the entire universe. Its possibilities are endless, has unlimited potentiality. And when we come to it with our conditions, we activate one of its potentials. And that's a beautiful way that's one way to think about emptiness that I find beautiful. And so that brings us back to our original point that situations in the Huayan view, that the totality, the one in the all and the all in the one, we can take a situation and know that actually that situation could literally be experienced in every imaginable way possible. And it is only our conditions, our conditioning, our activation of a single potential that makes it show up as something bad or something good. And to think that the situation itself contains those characteristics, meaning when someone says, I didn't have a mother and a father, to think that that automatically shows up to us, that it in itself is a bad thing, is delusional. And in fact, my experience, I didn't grow up with my biological mother and father. And now I have Baba Mama in Hufei, China. That is a direct kind of pointing to of the emptiness of situations. Meaning I don't think I suffered but I run into a lot of people who imagine I must have suffered. And I found that always confusing, and that was before I studied Zen and found out about Kongxi, or emptiness. And what's the problem with this, or how do we apply this? It just means that things are not determinable ahead of time, so that the future is kind of wide open, and that we can experience, depending on the quality of our mind, we can experience the world dramatically differently. And that the reason we experience the world is not because of the external reality. It is because the conditioning of our own mind. So to experience having a mother and father is a terrible thing. We have to be probably rooted in comparison, rooted in seeing good and bad in that, imbuing all these qualities, all these things that the phenomena in themselves do not have. And it can be very hard to set this in. This is conceptual, but I understand this as an experience directly. So it's easy to argue about emptiness and say, well, aren't there some situations that are totally clear ahead of time? You know, like murder or any of these things, terrible things that happen, aren't they really terrible? And the harsh reality, or the reality, depending on how you are conditioned to take it in, is that none of those things in and of themselves are terrible. They don't have any quality. They're empty. And yet we bring the qualities to it. Now, realizing that, experiencing that directly, can free us from suffering. Right? Realizing the emptiness of things means that we really think that Democrats are this way and Republicans are that way. Right? We think they have intrinsic qualities, and we think their experiences are similar or different, truly different. And of course, that's a hallucination. That's not noticing that within the Democrat group, there's people experiencing the world like the Republican group. They're interpenetrated, even though it looks to our minds like true division, like truly this experience versus that experience. We don't see that those experiences are also similar. And the same thing for seeing a poor person and a rich person and thinking they must experience the world very differently. But emptiness tells us that that situation of, let's say, poverty and richness doesn't tell us how someone's going to consciously experience that. We think we can tell ahead of time the people who have privilege and don't have privilege. We think that tells us something about the conscious experience, and we put it into good and bad. But as I said before, we cannot know ahead of time that the people we call privileged are having a positive experience, conscious experience of that, and therefore suffering less than those who are not privileged. And we see the not privileged as not as suffering more. This is a delusion. This is a hallucination. It shows up to us because we created these categories, because we imbued them with meaning, and because we believed them to be reality and not coming from our own minds. So we just heard a sound, and I could say it's a motorcycle sound. And I could say that there's ways of experiencing that. And I could say motorcycle sounds are annoying and bother the listeners. But I know, because of my experience of emptiness and the inside of emptiness, that some people will find it perfectly fine, and some people will actually find it a nice break in the audio, or some people will find it horrific and that they should turn this off. And so the whole array of possibilities or potentialities, depending on how many people are listening, can be experienced. So knowing that the motorcycle sound is empty, it allows, that's just the reality. And confusing myself into thinking that it's just bad means that then I go into suffering. Then I start suffering because I see it as bad and I want to get away from it and I must avoid it. And it's happening all the time. But then realizing, you can realize both at the same time, that one, that's a hallucination. And then you can also still decide not to have the motorcycle sound in it. But also knowing that that motorcycle sound would also be experienced as its other potentialities of ways of it being experienced means that you're freed from the suffering of having these very fixed views. And those fixed views, what they do is they make your reality very fragile, because reality is not fixed like that. It's impermanent. It's always moving. It's always changing. Things are shifting. And our fixed meanings, our fixed concepts are imbued with predictability. The predictability we want, the ground we want, is actually always moving. And that creates suffering and agitation, right? So that's just an overview of the strange nature of reality that goes against our conventional sense of reality as easily to see that this is that and this is that. And it makes, I hope that it can bring you to really question your ideas about things, situations that people explain that show up to you as easily differentiable between a good experience and a bad experience, between suffering and not suffering, between attachment and non-attachment, or attachment and aversion, and see how you have already loaded it up, that your mind has already loaded it up with a lot of assumptions about someone else's experience or your experience. And then also notice the emptiness in that it is possible that it could be otherwise, that it could be the opposite, that it could be an alternative, and that you essentially don't know, which moves me to the last concept. There's a concept in Zen, and even a class or a kind of school of Zen in Korean Buddhism called Don't Know Mind. And there's this koan where one of the punchlines is, not knowing is most intimate. And it's saying that when you realize emptiness, you realize that you don't know. And it's not a confusion. It's not like, oh, I don't know, I'm stupid. That's an extra judgment on top of that. It's actually, wow, it's utterly undetermined. It's indeterminate. That's our world. It's groundless. It's shifting. We don't know. So, see if you can sit with that idea that the stories being told to you, you're already interpreting them and imbuing them with good and bad, right and wrong, suffering and not suffering. And notice that this is coming from your own mind. And notice when someone disagrees with you, that they are seeing the world in a different way, a different dream than yours. So, thank you for listening to The Art of Non-Discrimination. I'll see you next time.